For the next few segments, our legal panel is here. I don't want to start by introducing them. If you're a regular viewer, you know the guys. Jim Kasuris, he's a criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sitting on the board of directors of the New York City Criminal Bar Association, frequently lecturing at New York Law School, the Bar Association's Queens in New York City, is sometimes even across the pond as well. Mayo Bartlett, an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLC, appropriately named. He's also former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. All right, guys, let's start with an issue close to our studios, but certainly something that's now had national significance, the measles outbreak. I want to start with some numbers first of all. The Centers for Disease Control says there have now been 90 new cases reported in just the past couple weeks. As a reminder, this is 2019. It puts the nationwide number for this year, just this year, at 555, only April. That number already exceeds the amount of cases we have seen for the 2 prior years combined. And it is now spread to 20 states. Michigan is one of them, and one man responsible for dozens of cases in just that state. A traveler raising money for an ultra-Orthodox charity in Brooklyn makes a road trip to the Midwest, stopped in many places along the way, stayed in people's homes, visited synagogues, went shopping. That man wound up infecting 39 people. As an example, that's how fast this thing can spread. Then you go to one of the epicenters of it, Rockland County. That's a county just north of New York City for folks outside of the metropolitan area, and they've been dealing with one of the worst outbreaks in the entire country. As much as 200 confirmed cases to this point. Just yesterday, the county leaders outlined plans to try, keyword try, to deal with the outbreak. So, people who've been exposed to measles and those who are under 18 and unvaccinated, they're supposed to stay home, away from public places for at least up to 3 weeks. If they're caught violating the rule, they could be fined up to $2,000 per day. Now, last month, the county exec, Ed Day, he issued an emergency declaration. It banned people without shots from going into public, but a judge issued an injunction blocking that. Here is Day from his news conference just yesterday.
We were ahead of the crisis, but our efforts have been hamstrung by recent court rulings. The fact of the matter is that we have had 5 cases go to intensive care units, including 1 infant. Need we wait for someone to die?
So, guys, in recent days and weeks, I've had attorneys representing the group that felt that they were being marginalized by that, giving arguments. I've had medical professionals talking about how this is imminently preventable, but yet science somehow is taking a backseat to misinformation. We've had people reporting on the ground about these 40-page pamphlets that are completely riddled with lies about supposedly cow's blood and rat feces and elements that are not in these vaccines whatsoever. In 2000, we had this thing cured, and now here we are. So I want to ask some legal questions because at the end, that probably, hopefully, will be who weighs in. Okay, the courts, at least to this point, have said you can't, unless you quarantine somebody, you can't really restrict someone's movement. We'll find out if what the county exec wants to do is hold up. But what if, and I'll go through some hypotheticals, and Jimmy, start with you. You choose not to vaccinate your child. Your child ends up going into a public place and gets other unvaccinated children, especially newborns, sick as a consequence. If I'm the parent of the child, do I have any recourse to say, hey, the county told you don't go into public places. You made an elective choice not to vaccinate your child. Mine's too young to be completely vaccinated. I had a reasonable expectation that I could go to a park without being infected by measles. Do I have recourse against that parent?
Well, I think it depends. If you send your child into a public place knowing that the child is infected, then you may. The problem with this executive order is it's basically saying if you're not vaccinated, you can't go into public places. So the argument was we may not be vaccinated, but we're not infected, and that's a violation of our rights, and it's probably true. I mean, it's a very difficult situation to deal with, but in direct response to your question, I think that there may be a cause of action if you know that your child is infected.
In Mayo, we've seen in New York City, the mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, he has made multiple pleas here. He's called it an outbreak. I should tell you, by the way, the world Health Association, they've said that of the top 10 crises facing the world, this is now in the top 10, the non-vaccinations. It doesn't stop at the U.S. border, obviously. You're going to developed nations and non-developed nations where this nonsense. But I want to play the soundbite from the mayor, and then also just so people know that this is not some empirical statement that every yeshiva, for example, subscribes to this, because as you'll see in a second, a lot of leaders within the faith are saying this is a canard, and by the way, you need to get vaccinated, you can't go to school. But first, let's take a listen to the mayor.
Schools that do not actively participate in helping us address this issue, if they persist in allowing this danger to continue, we have the option of closing them for a period of time, because soon it will be Pesach. There'll be school vacation. There'll be more and more families together. The last thing we want to see is more family members afflicted by this disease.
I want to bring up a couple of statements here from both religious leaders. This came in the Jewish week here. It said, in Judaism, no religious law forbids vaccinations, even in cases where the vaccine includes gelatin, an ingredient made from pig tissue. The ban on consuming non-kosher meat does not apply to vaccines administered via injection. And moreover, you have the Forward, who is, by definition, a pretty conservative publication who defends, every right, every opportunity of all the different denominations within Judaism. They said major Orthodox leaders in Brooklyn have encouraged Jews to get vaccinated, with some local yeshiva saying they will no longer accept unvaccinated students. The Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem, it's the biggest yeshiva in the world, told its rabbis and over 8,000 students to immediately get a vaccine in November. So, Mayo, we get to the next question. Parents choose not to vaccinate their child after all of the mandates, after all of the concerns. Kid still goes to school, and another kid gets sick. I'm the parent. Do I have recourse to not only go after maybe the parent, but also the school for having an environment? I mean, it may not be fair, but do they have a right to say, listen, you're putting my kids in harm's way for going to their protected right to go to school?
You can bring a lawsuit. There's nothing that stops anybody from bringing any lawsuit. It doesn't mean you're going to be successful. In order to be successful, you have to prove causation. So that means that you would have to isolate your child's illness to coming into contact with the person you want to sue, and into having contact only at that school. So for instance, we know that if you go to, let's say, a mall, you're likely to come in contact with the measles now in a lot of places. And so it's very difficult for you to say that it's only because my child came into contact with this one person. So without that, you really don't have much of a case.
Now, religious exemptions seem to be at the crux of all this,
you
right?
just took the words out of my mouth.
To me, when I've read this in different states, it's highly interpretive. I mean, in terms of how subjective it is as to what qualifies for it or not. We just heard leading members of the faith saying, no, this is misinformation you're basing this off of. It isn't our faith that mandates this at all. Can people still claim that, even if religious leaders are saying it doesn't count?
And that's exactly what I was going to ask. I think that's an interesting question, because you have certainly religious exemptions, but then you also have the substantial interest of the state to protect its citizens. And what these statements are seemingly suggesting is that this should not qualify as a religious exemption. If these religious leaders are saying there is absolutely no religious bar to taking this vaccination, then I think the religious exemption part of it is what needs to be looked at more carefully.
Because we've seen with the Amish or Jehovah's Witnesses conscientious objector status in terms of military or wartime. This one, just because I say it doesn't make it so if my faith is saying no.
Well, but then we still get into the question of how a person actually practices their religion. So you can look at a Catholic versus a Protestant. You can look at different denominations of either.
Okay, but here's my question, Neil. Just because I say my faith says it's okay to use corporal punishment on my child, okay? The law doesn't. You're not allowed to beat your kid to a pulp.
No, but that's a little different than saying because I'm of a particular religion, I'm exempt from vaccines. And at some point, if the government recognizes certain religions and not others, then you have to look at the First Amendment to determine whether they're actually establishing religion.
Do you guys think finally, I know we're going to hit a break here, that the law is going to have to clarify where the line starts and stops?
It absolutely is, especially in a situation like this. You see this outbreak and how quickly it's spreading. You know, it could spread internationally. I mean, people brought it into the country. People can leave the country, and I think there's a very substantial interest here.
And
But
by the
we're
way,
not
this
talking-
doesn't just start and stop with measles. We're already seeing scarlet fever. We're seeing mumps. I mean, this is, I'm going to editorialize, this is crazy. Okay.
Hepatitis is much more prevalent than all of these things. We're not discussing that.
Right.
When we come back, a tale of two actresses. We're talking about the Varsity Blues case. Felicia Huffman pled guilty in the college admission scandal. We've talked about that. And now she could actually face several months of prison time. Lori Rockland, though, she chose to enter a not guilty plea, and she could get several years if found guilty. We'll discuss the strategies here at the table and how this works. Stay with us.